President.
Phil.
Mr. President, I move that leave be given to bring in a bill for an act to amend the Petroleum Onshore Act 1991 to impose a moratorium on the prospecting for or the mining of coal seam gas in New South Wales and to reintroduce the public interest as a ground for certain decisions relating to petroleum titles and for related purposes, the Petroleum Onshore Amendment Coal Seam Gas Moratorium Bill.
Is leave granted? There being no objection, the honourable member may proceed.
Mr. President, I present the bill and move that the bill be read for a first time and printed.
Motion to that the honourable member. All in favour say aye. Against say no. I believe the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Clerk.
Petroleum Onshore Amendment Coal Seam Gas Moratorium Bill 2019, first read.
Mr. President. Mr. President, I move that this bill be now read a second time. I'm proud to be able to introduce the Coal Seam Gas Moratorium Bill 2019 today. I first went to the Pilliga Forest in 2011. I went there to see coal seam gas exploration wells that were at that time being operated by the owner of the Pilliga coal seam gas licences, Eastern Star Gas. I went there with Jeremy Buckingham, who will be familiar to many in this House, and Max Phillips, and were shown around by a local landholder, Mr Tony Pickard. It was quite astonishing. Rusty old wellheads hissing gas in the middle of a dry forest, old fracking ponds with ripped linings, some with half-rotting kangaroos in them that had drowned after trying to drink the toxic sludge, swathes of dead forest where some form of liquid had obviously flowed over onto the sandy soil and had just simply killed absolutely anything it had touched. It was really hard to believe, looking at what you saw on the ground. It was an environmental disaster. We started working with landholders and others in the community, calling out this disaster publicly and in the parliament, and also highlighting the deep political connections of Eastern Star Gas, which was chaired by former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, Nationals John Anderson. It wasn't long before Santos stepped in to buy out the project to try and stem the bad press Eastern Star Gas was giving to the industry more broadly. They paid $900 million in 2011 for Eastern Star Gas. At that time, there was a plan for 500 wells in the Pilliga, the largest surviving remnant of temperate woodland in Australia, and a recharge zone for the Great Artesian Basin. Santos was given a special fast track on the Narrabri gas project by then Deputy Premier and New South Wales Nationals Party leader, the Honourable Andrew Stoner, on 21 February 2014. The New South Wales Government signed an MOU with Santos to designate it a strategic energy project and committed to rapid assessment of it. The MOU specified that Santos would submit an EIS by 30 June that year, that's 2014, and the government committed to make its decision about the project by 23 January 2015 and for gas to flow by 2017. Well, in December 2015, Santos wrote down the value of the Narrabri gas project to $0. Santos failed to meet any of the agreed timelines in their MOU with the New South Wales Government to submit its EIS. It was not submitted, as we now know, until 3 years later in February 2017. Government agencies made timely submissions outlining crucial information gaps that needed to be filled to complete the assessment by Santos. Santos submitted a response to submissions not until April 2018, and it failed to provide the information requested. In July 2018, the government again wrote to Santos seeking this information. Santos did not respond until April 2019 and again refused to provide the crucial information requested. It's expected, however, that at some stage this year, possibly early next year, the New South Wales Planning Minister will make a referral of the Narrabri gas project to the Independent Planning Commission for consideration of its proposals to now drill 850 coal seam gas wells in the Pilliga Forest. Critical questions remain about how massive volumes of salt that will be produced from the treated, extracted water will be managed, and how the creeping industrialisation of the landscape as a result of this project, including massive pipelines to transport any produced gas to the East Coast gas market, will impact on viable farmland. New South Wales sits at a crossroads on this CSG question. We've been close to this crossroad for a while, I think. The community sort of helped push it away, but we really do sit here now. This bill aims to pick a path when it comes to protecting land and water and communities and climate from coal seam gas. It's a disaster industry. It's a disaster for land, it's a disaster for water, it's a disaster for local industries, particularly farming, but we also now know manufacturing across the country. It's a disaster for local communities. They promise the world, the gas companies, and then they leave those communities pretty much abandoned as they move on. It's been an economic disaster for the country manufacturing as the uncontrolled move to a gas export industry, of which Santos is one of the biggest contributors, has made Australia both the world's biggest exporter of LNG, but left us with one of the highest domestic prices for gas. It's so absurd there are now 2 proposals to import gas to New South Wales, 2 terminal proposals in this state. 9 years after the public debate in New South Wales kicked off in a really big way around CSG, in that time it's seen most of the proposals in this state for coal seam gas fall by the wayside as communities have risen up and the truth about what coal seam gas and other frack gas really means for land, water and communities has become evident. 9 years later, it is time for this parliament to act to put a brake on an industry that offers only downside. Only downside to our community, only downside to our economy. The community have acted, but the parliament is yet to back them up. This is not the first time such a bill, all these issues have been considered and debated by the parliament. The idea of a moratorium falls out of the findings of the 2011 Upper House inquiry into coal seam gas that was driven by Jeremy Buckingham and the Shooters and Fishers Party MLC, the Honourable Robert Brown, who chaired the inquiry. Jeremy then introduced the coal seam gas moratorium bill in 2011, following the report of that inquiry, and another bill to ban CSG in 2015. The Honourable Adam Searle introduced a moratorium bill for coal seam gas and other unconventional gas on behalf of New South Wales Labor in 2015. If any of these bills were passed, we wouldn't be here today, and the Pilliga Forest and water resources and farmland in the surrounding area wouldn't be facing the risk of an unsustainable coal seam gas industry rolling across their landscape. But with this parliament, we have a unique opportunity, with different numbers in the upper house, with a number of parties who made strong commitments during the last state election, and some even before that, to do something to address the risk of coal seam gas development, that we can get a moratorium bill through this House. We can get it through and we can put maximum pressure on the New South Wales government to reset industry and energy policy in this state that doesn't take the path towards toxic, unconventional gas development. The Nationals lost Barwon, in part because of their mismanagement of water in this state, in part because of the coalition support for coal seam gas in Narrabri. The community took out their frustration on the National Party and it voted them out. The party that replaced them had a strong position on this project and on this industry. The Nationals know CSG is deadly for them come election time. It was deadly in Ballina, it's hurt them in Lismore, it's hurt them in Barwon. They will be cautious not to be on the wrong side of the debate. If we work together to get this bill through the upper house, there will be significant pressure in the lower house on those members to consider crossing the floor to oppose CSG and put an end to this industry in this state. This moratorium bill reflects the risks of coal seam gas development that are based on the lived experiences of those communities who have already gone down this troubling path, those in Queensland and the US who have seen this industry march across their landscape, polluting land and water. It reflects our growing scientific understanding of the carbon footprint of this industry, that is anything other than a useful transition fuel, but is rather a greenhouse gas emission disaster. It continues the work of communities like those in the Northern Rivers who have made their case and won their freedom from gas development, communities like those in Bentley who stood in front of the machines and the police to protect their land and water, like Gloucester who stood so strong and just would not stop making the case for their community until AGL had no choice but to admit defeat and to reorientate their entire business. Communities on the Hunter and Central Coast, Sydney and the Blue Mountains and the Illawarra, who marched in their thousands and made the case of the insanity of this sort of industry in an urban environment, and communities like Gurley and Ballatta and the Northern Tablelands, who got the ear of government then about the devastation this industry would cause on those farming districts of the Moree Plains and surrounds. It does make one wonder how some communities got listened to at that time, whilst others got ignored. The question now remains, if CSG was so wrong for so many areas, that have seen so many licences torn up in this state, How is it acceptable at Narrabri and in the Pilliga? If you haven't seen firsthand, like I have in Queensland and the US, how this industry marches across the landscape, that it needs more wells each year to maintain production, and more water, and more chemicals, and more trucks, and more pollution, you haven't done your due diligence on how this industry operates. If you think this is just a plan to drill a few holes in a dry forest, you haven't listened to the communities who know this is just a foot in the door that will open up that entire region. That will mean roads and pipelines crisscrossing the landscape and carving up the surrounding farming districts. That will mean one of the key recharge areas for the Great Artesian Basin being pin-marked with holes for an industry that we know has no solution to deal with the toxic chemicals that they use to frack wells, has no plan to deal with the salt that will come out with the extracted water from those wells. It's a disaster. It is madness to put at risk our land and our water when the world is quickly moving to new and exciting alternatives in renewable energy. We have an opportunity in this place now to take a different path, and for this reason I am proud to introduce a bill that would place a moratorium on coal seam gas development across the state. Before I go into the details of the bill, I just want to acknowledge all those who are the Lock the Gate movement that has been such a potent force for protecting land and water over so many years. There is no way I can name all of the people who are involved. They know who they are. Many still have signs on their gates and their front paddocks and their houses. They should be proud that so much of the state that was covered with CSG licences in 2011 no longer is. Well, you did that. You did that. There's just a little bit more to do. I now want to turn to the details of the bill. The bill has 4 key elements. Firstly, it imposes a moratorium on the prospecting for or mining of coal seam gas across New South Wales. It applies no-go zones to particular areas deemed off-limits, such as the local government areas of the Northern Rivers, drinking water catchments, national parks, residential areas and prime agricultural land.
Sounds familiar.
Sounds very familiar. 3, it provides for the establishment of a standing expert advisory body on coal seam gas of experts across disciplines who would advise governments on the impact, including cumulative impacts and the risks of coal seam gas, and in relation to the potential lifting of any moratorium. It reduces the public interest test, it reintroduces the public interest test as a relevant ground when considering petroleum titles. While the focus in the public at the moment is very much the Narrabri gas project, this bill does seek to address CSG issues statewide. The bill includes some of the recommendations of the Chief Scientist and Engineer, Professor Mary O'Kane, made in her final report of the independent review of coal seam gas activities in New South Wales, published in September 24. It largely reflects, and this is why it will be familiar to many in this House, the bill introduced by the Honourable Adam Searle on behalf of the Labor opposition back in 2015. In speaking to his coal seam gas and other unconventional gas moratorium bill at that time, the honourable member put on the record Labor's strong position on coal seam gas that they had brought to the 2015 state election. He introduced it. An immediate statewide moratorium on coal seam and other unconventional gas exploration activity, while the environmental, scientific and regulatory design work recommended by the New South Wales Chief Scientist and Engineer in her September 2014 report is undertaken and implemented in full. And then he went on to say, this is to be underpinned by a range of immediate and permanent no-go zones. This is not the only policy of the Labor Party opposition, but also, this is not only the policy of the Labor opposition, but also the recommendation of the Legislative Council Select Committee on the Supply and Cost of Gas and Liquid Fuels in New South Wales, given on 25 February 2015. After the mistakes of the past by governments of all major parties, this is the right and necessary course of action. Those were the remarks of the Honourable Adam Searle when introducing his bill. The Honourable Walt Secord said in relation to the public interest test provisions that were part of that bill at that time and in this bill as well, this bill is a direct response to repair the damage done by the Liberal Nationals government removal of the public interest test that was previously in the legislation. The direct result of that removal is being played out across our communities, who are furious that CSG and unconventional gas licence holders have all the power over local communities and councils in our region. Let us be clear, and I again am quoting the Honourable Walt Secord here. These laws did have a public interest test, but that was before the Liberal National Coalition ripped it away. What can we conclude about a government that removes a public interest test from its CSG legislation? We can conclude it is intent on destroying the public interest. I thank Mr Jeremy Buckingham for giving the Chamber an opportunity to revisit this important matter. I thank my colleague, the Honourable Adam Searle, for his forensic work and weeks of research behind his amendments. That was, of course, to the 2015 bill that Jeremy Buckingham had introduced. Despite the government promising to implement all of the Chief Scientist's recommendations in full, and that were a critical part of Labor's introduction of a moratorium bill, that hasn't meaningfully occurred. A lock-the-gate scorecard reveals complete failure, really, of the government in protecting people's health, water, farmland, as well as landholder and community rights through the full implementation of those recommendations. This state's best farmland and water resources are still vulnerable to destruction from the coal seam gas industry. That is the key point. Similarly, I'd like to point out that to the opposition, the Shooters and Fishers and Farmers Party took to the last election a strong policy of, and I'm quoting now from their policy, immediate moratorium on coal seam gas projects in New South Wales and a permanent ban in the Northern Rivers until the New South Wales Government implements all 16 recommendations of the Chief Scientist and Engineers report into CSG activities in New South Wales. Of course, the Greens have maintained a clear and strong position against coal seam gas development since 2010, recognising the environmental, climate, social and economic risks of the industry. The Animal Justice Party and Christian Democratic Party also previously supported the 2015 ban bill brought to this House by Mr Buckingham. It's now time for the Parliament to act. The Narrabri project is a sword of Damocles over the people of New South Wales and the landholders, communities and landscape of the New England Northwest. This is not an industry that once started can be easily stopped, and the damage is often not clear until too late. We can act now to press pause on the Narrabri project, though I acknowledge that the provisions in this bill make coal seam gas an unlikely proposition generally in New South Wales. That is the case because this is not an industry that is in the interest of the state of New South Wales. If it can pass the tests that this bill sets out, so be it, but I'm yet to see how this industry can operate in the public interest. But the tests that this bill lays out are in the interest of the people in New South Wales, of our land, of our water, of our farmland and of our industries. For those who might get up in this debate and try to make an economic argument or an energy supply argument for this industry, I caution you to do your homework. It is also being proposed by a company that has deliberately sought to cause the gas price rise in this country for their own benefit, their own profits, against the community interest and against the interests of so many workers and industries in this country and state. The price of gas in the East Coast gas market has risen dramatically since the Queensland and federal government allowed 3 LNG export terminals to be built in Gladstone, exposing Australia's East Coast gas market to the international market and higher world prices. IPART has stated that, and I'm quoting, the main driver for price increases is structural changes in the wholesale gas market, including increased exposure to international gas market. A Credit Suisse research note from 2014 reviewing the return on investment for Santos's Gladstone LNG venture noted that, and I'm quoting, Santos now argues that its aim in GLNG was always as much about raising the domestic gas price and therefore re-rating large parts of the portfolio outside of its GLNG project as it was about that project. The Narrabri gas field will produce at best 5.2% of the volume of Gladstone LNG exports. It cannot affect the price of gas on the East Coast while we're connected to the international market. The conventional gas industry has made clear there is more than enough gas available to meet domestic demands. We do not need this project. We don't need it for a gas supply. It won't reduce the price of gas. All it will do is impact on land and on water and on communities and the industries. By comparison, unconventional gas is expensive gas. Unconventional gas fields are high cost, low yield and operations. That's in comparison to those conventional gas plants that are currently delivering for our domestic needs. Unconventional gas, fracked gas, coal seam gas, shale gas, however you want to call it, it takes a lot of infrastructure and hundreds of wells. It's expensive and damaging. If this is your future energy solution, you are just not looking close enough. I'd like to put on the record that I've reached out to a number of members and parties seeking to work together on this bill. I make clear here in my second reading that I'm certainly open to continue those discussions. I'm interested in an outcome here for the New South Wales community, for the Narrabri community, for land and water, for our climate. I'm open to working on amendments. I'm open to working on a different form of legislation that we can get through this House and put that pressure, in particular on the National Party, to do what is right for the people of this state and the people of Narrabri. We've got a closing window of time to ensure that the disaster of CSG isn't visited upon the Pilliga forest and on the Narrabri community. I hope we can work together in this place to pass a bill and challenge the New South Wales government to once and for all put CSG to bed in this state. I think all members have to ask themselves that question: are you with the community on this? Are you with our land and water on this question, or are you with Santos, a company that's been a major donor to both the major parties in this state, that have openly acknowledged their intention to drive up gas prices in this country, who have been fined for polluting water in the Narrabri region? Their interests clearly start and stop with their bottom line, certainly not with the community, not with the environment. I commend the bill to the House.